We must speak the truth about terror. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories, malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
Huh? What happens? I tell you what happens. Blam!
I have a window that looks directly at the World Trade Center, and I saw...
No collusion!
Shit's getting way too complicated for me.
Welcome to the morning antidote. Not so live this time. We're just going to do a run through. This is Jeremy Rothko Show.
Oh, sorry. Oh, my bad. That's why we're testing here. This is Greg McCarran.
All right. This is a new format for us. We're working on this as a fairly regular morning news show where we just run through a limited number of recent stories and quickly discuss them. So let's go right to it, Greg. Here we go.
All right, let's get into it. In our first story, this is from Vanity Fair. The president threw us under the bus, embedding with Pentagon leadership in Trump's chaotic last week. And this is one of those articles that tends to be, it's presented and put out there as a tell-all about the inside account of how things were going within the Department of Defense. But as we're going to detail here, there's much, much more to this article than meets the eye on the surface.
It's definitely true. And the first thing that we noticed was the author of the article, Adam Saralski. And this is interesting. Almost no one has brought this up. And there's tons of discussions about how people, this is such an interest, like I pointed out in this first tweet about this, fascinating read with cameos. Like it's a movie, right? From Kash Patel, Ezra Cohen Watnick, and an amusingly candid Chris Miller, you know. The president threw us under the bus, quotes, you know, embedded, right? And so basically this is the story by just some journalist guy, right? Just some journalist at Vanity Fair, Adam Saralski, about the last days of this very blatant Trump cell that was installed post-election into the highest levels of Pentagon command structure. And someone like Ezra Cohen Watnick is someone we've been tracking the entire Trump years, basically. And there he is, reinstalled at the top levels there. And what's interesting is that it does play, it seems like a script, a movie. It sort of seems to give you scenes in your mind of what actually happened. And they definitely appear to be trying to humanize themselves. Kash Patel, I think, is quoted as saying things, we were just ending some wars, or so. What did he say? What did Patel say? Ending some wars? I forget what he said, but he quoted Patel like basically he was
I think I don't have the article.
Oh, right. And you know what's interesting about this? Let's read through this. Miller, that's Christopher Miller, right? The acting head of the Pentagon, Secretary of Defense. Miller insisted the president had been in good spirits. Quote, I know the media portrays it a little differently, unquote, he insisted, though he might have been putting on his game face with me. Quote, I got to take the guy's temperature, you know. What orifice did he use to take his temperature? We're not sure. Okay, make sure that we're in a good place, and I'm very, very comfortable, very confident, unquote. I then showed him the long lens photo of the MyPillow CEO, Lindell, coming into the White House with a memo referencing, quote, martial law, unquote. He laughed, quickly did the math, and figured he and Patel left the grounds before the picture was taken. When I inquired about the meaning of the words, quote, move Kash Patel to CIA acting, unquote, on Lindell's briefing papers, he chuckled, quote, maybe he's got a new job then, right? Get out of my hair. That's funny. That's my pillow guy, huh? Okay, unquote. And then and then they actually admit that they weren't thinking about doing that.
This is interesting because on one hand, it is very much what you're referring to. I think it was more Christopher Miller that was quoted about the forever wars and the good thing that Trump was doing in terms of like trying to end some of our forever wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. It appears that was more Christopher Miller being quoted in that regard in this article. But what's interesting, it's a combination of keeping that narrative alive while also making this whole thing like the January 6th and the events surrounding it. Oh, the buck began and ended with Trump. It wasn't any of us or really even anyone else you need to look at. No, just look at Trump. he threw us to the wolves, basically. He threw us under the bus and abandoned, and I think there's even a quote in there by Ezra Cohen himself. And anybody who's listened to our programs for any period of time, you've heard us talk about Ezra Cohen at various points over the years. This particular quote from Ezra Cohen that I'm referring to here was, I'm finding it right now. Sorry.
Okay, while you're doing that, I found what I was looking for from Cash Patel. And this is from the story. Wow. And there, what's interesting is that a lot of this is downplaying all the severity of the dangers, because they're talking about the E-4B, the doomsday plane, and they're talking about all their roles in going through places in terms of the nuclear command center, like Stratcom at Offutt Air Force Base, right? Quote, that evening over beers and a 2 for $20 special at an Applebee's near Fort Campbell. I mean, these guys are just normal guys. They're just eating at Applebee's. Patel was reflective. Quote, they thought we'd blow the place up, unquote, he recalled. Quote, but we're just getting shit done. Ended 3 wars. Went to Damascus for American journalist and hostage Austin Tice, unquote. And even during a lame duck stewardship of the Pentagon, he added, quote, Chris and I said, we're going to fly every week, fuel the jet, unquote. In truth, the troops may be fewer, but the battles are far from over, and Austin Tice is still not home. See, this is journalist is really fact-checking them hard. Okay, go for it, Craig.
And so the particular, there's a couple of particular paragraphs in this. Ezra Cohen on one hand, gets to play the victim, following up on his article, the profile that you had sent me from a week or so ago, where it's he's decrying how people think I'm QAnon and all this stuff. There's a couple of quotes I want to read in here. I'm going to find the other one here in a second, but the first one is his promotion. This is Ezra Cohen, was fodder for trolls of every stripe. To the left, I became this horrible person that enabled the president, attacking Obama officials, and all this other stuff like that. Cohen contended as we sat in his kitchen and later drove through a Chick-fil-A. Once again, just normal guys before tooling around Northern Virginia, and then to the crazy people on the right that are dangerous people that did the horrible anti-democratic behavior at the Capitol. These nut jobs are saying that I am QAnon. Well, I can't possibly understand how someone could believe that it's so far-fetched that a protege of David Horowitz and Frank Gaffney, the Islamofascist Awareness Weeks at the University of Pennsylvania, the Chabad program at the University of Pennsylvania, would be complicit in attacking Obama officials. No way. I am utterly dumbfounded that somebody would believe that. And so
this is out of control. I mean, it's interesting too. They give some more background on Kash Patel, aid units such as Delta Force and SEAL Team 6, as they hunted down what he referred to as the, quote, the global rack and stack of bad guys, determined the order, established, find, fix, finish options, and then executed, unquote. Nunez background.
Oh, I got the other quote from. Here's the other Ezra Cohen quote I wanted to read, and I read this one on our stream last night with John Brisson. So Ezra Cohen, another of Miller's top confidants, believes that his colleagues' words and deeds may be well and good, but are beside the point. Quote, the president threw us under the bus. And when I say us, I don't mean only us political appointees or only us Republicans. He threw America under the bus. He caused a lot of damage to the fabric of this country. Did he go and storm the Capitol himself? No. But he, I believe, had an opportunity to tamp things down, and he chose not to. And that's really the fatal flaw. I mean, he's in charge, and when you're in charge, you're responsible for what goes wrong, end quote.
I don't know. That sounds like he let it happen, maybe by accident on purpose.
Yeah. When you think about the depths of what it appears went on, and also the things that we already know as far as surrounding the 6th, it's way deeper than the president just simply threw people under the bus. I mean.
But I'm sure this is just some journalist who got a scoop, right? Okay, let's check it out. All right, who's this journalist? Adam Saralski, all right, is an award-winning American journalist, television and film producer, and attorney. Many of his original reports have been optioned and adapted for film, as we'll see later, including his story about Eric Prince, his story about Harvey Weinstein's feverish last days. All right, but he's not
no
just
mention of Black Cube, I have to add.
No, I probably not. Okay, he is currently okay. So that he's won all these awards, the highest journalism's highest honors, a Peabody Award, all these awards. He is currently a contributing editor for Vanity Fair and has produced investigative stories and high-profile interviews for ABC News, CBS News, 60 Minutes, NBC News, and Vice on HBO. Before embarking on a career in journalism, Sorowski worked for the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. I've never heard of it, and the Office of the Secretary of Defense, OSD. Okay, so Milwaukee, Wisconsin, background there. As a student at George Washington University, Sorowski began working in the Pentagon's Office of Non-Proliferation Policy, where, among other things, he served as a representative to an interagency working group on the United States Special Commission on Iraq, UNSCOM. CIA, described as a, quote, wonderkind of the national security establishment, unquote. Sorowski's work caught the attention of the Central Intelligence Agency, which had offered him a slot in its legal honors program. During his tenure at the CIA, Sorowski handled a variety of sensitive matters involving CIA operations and officers and was honored with an Exceptional Performance Award from Director of Intelligence George Tenet. All right, now it gets really interesting. A lawsuit. In July 1997, Richard Clarke, your government failed you. No, cross that out in terms of 9/11, and add maybe kill, and maybe your government is too much. But remember Richard Clarke. This is a key character that's always forgotten about. And at one point, I'd identified a troika of dicks surrounding September 11th. Dick Clark, Dick Cheney, and Dick Pearl. As you want to understand some of the macro aspects of 9/11, you look at those three dicks, okay? In July 1997, Richard Clarke, then President Clinton's counterterrorism czar, offered Sorowski a rotational position at the National Security Council, NSC. However, the CIA's counterespionage group, CEG, blocked the rotation, citing concerns about Sorowski's, quote, Jewish roots, unquote. Sorowski fought the allegations and, in so doing, unearthed many documents, including an incendiary memorandum from a top CIA official. Quote, I'd like to know if he admits his family has actual contacts with right-wing politicians like Prime Minister Netanyahu. If not contacts, then maybe his family has donated money to Israeli government causes. From my experience with rich Jewish friends from college, I would fully expect Adam's wealthy daddy to support Israeli political or social causes in some form or other, perhaps through the United Jewish Appeal, unquote. This is very interesting because this is intelligence speak. I think this guy knows this, whoever this is.
And this also goes back to that crucial, I think a pretty crucial period in lead up to the public learning, the Monica Lewinsky scandal, which of course, as I think all roads do lead back to very much to Israel in terms of a combination of Israel and the vast right-wing conspiracy that Hillary Clinton perhaps honestly actually described. And you think about this is important because 1997, the second Clinton administration, is very interesting, where you had the it was talked about at the time, the overt Jewish nature of the administration, with Madeleine Albright as Secretary of State. You had Cohen as Defense Secretary, and I believe you had Sandy Berger as National Security Advisor. Meanwhile, this is a different level than that, because this is specifically talking about not just Jews, but particularly being involved with this very hostile, as we've learned over the years, over the decades, very hostile to American interest. And of course, whatever you want to call American interest, and not necessarily even our idea of what American interest would or should be, but taking that aside, American interest as far as like what is actually in the interest of like the American national defense, national security, foreign policy of this Netanyahu faction that has proven itself to be very hostile to that. So this was coming up in the lead up to the events that ultimately really were used to, it seems, to attempt to remove President Clinton, all largely driven by Israeli interests and by Netanyahu interests. So it's interesting, Sorowski was identified like this within the CIA in the lead up to all that.
Oh my gosh, dude. This is I hadn't heard about any of this. This is, and I don't know the timing on this because his positions in the Pentagon and Central Intelligence in the run up to September 11th are interesting, especially involving the question of Iraq, right? Nuclear weapons and Iraq. That's that. Oh, look, there's another interesting guy. Who there he is. Scott, Scott Ritter. We'll return to him. But okay, so this is let's just read a little bit more here because there's a few more interesting characters. Suralski subsequently, while under investigation by the CEG, the CIA's counter espionage group, I doubt that they just investigate him because he's Jewish, or that he's from a wealthy Jewish background. I sort of doubt. I bet they got a little bit more on him than that. Suralski was subjected to a polygraph, but the way that this will be sort of talked about, I think, is meant to. I think we'll see certain things replicated in terms of the style of the way that this incident is talked about in terms of his background, in the way that he writes his quote unquote journalism to in relationship to the role of the Pentagon cell of Patel, Cohen, and Miller at the end of the 11/9 operation. In the run-up to the 1/6/21 operation. Okay, while under investigation by the CEG, Suralski was subjected to a polygraph test, which one of the agency's own documents suggests was rigged. Quote, CIA Director Tenet says this guy is out of here because of his lack of candor. Subject is scheduled for a poly. Once that's over, it looks like we'll be waving goodbye to our friend, unquote. Suralski subsequently passed the polygraph test administered by the former chief of the FBI Polygraph Lab. Suralski subsequently sued the CIA for discrimination. The case prompted a CIA investigation of the CEG and led the agency to hire the Anti-Defamation League to provide sensitivity training to CEG employees.
Oh, that's that.
Oh, it's
once again, this is not just. And once again, this is not just sensitivity training as it relates to people who are Jewish, who just happen to be Jewish for the sake of being Jewish. No, I believe this is ultimately sensitivity training that comes down to particular nests that have been identified as being very hostile to actual American interests. So,
I mean, you can't think of another unless they just named like Jinsa or something like that to be the sensitivity trainer. You can't imagine a more militant in terms of protecting and implementing actual Israeli spying in terms of an organization than the ADL. You can't think of it. I mean, they were caught helping foreign governments spy on Americans via dirtied up moles and police departments in the West Coast. Going way back, they were helping the Israeli intelligence gain access to Palestinian solidarity activists, even like U.S. Congress people, up to senators, and even people like Pete, what's his name? Pete Stark, is that his name? From California. I believe he was on their list. An Arab activist in the L.A. area, got suspiciously murdered during that time period. They were working with South African intelligence and also funneling them information. Of course, Israel had a long history with apartheid South Africa in terms of teaming up for even the production or the testing of nuclear weapons back to the late 70s, actually. So this is, sensitivity training. So you need to be sensitive to our right to spy on you without consequences is what it really seems like. Okay. All right. But let's finish reading this. Let's see the Wikipedia. This is the framing of the Wikipedia. During the case, it was revealed that Suralski CIA polygraph administrator referred to him as, quote, that little Jew bastard, unquote, when speaking to a colleague. Tenet conceded that the agency's actions were, quote, insensitive, inappropriate, and unprofessional, unquote, and could be construed as anti-Semitic. Suralski's 2010 deposition of CIA Director George Tenet is considered unprecedented. It sounds about unprecedented. Victoria Tenzing, that's interesting. The former chief counsel for the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. Oh, by the way, on this, turns out I just saw a report that If you go into the volume 5, we covered that a little bit. Volume 5, Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, their last report on 2016 election interference by foreign actors. And they say in there that they were unable to get the data, the communications from Cambridge Analytica. And it turns out that from the UK. The UK basically reports that they were never asked by this Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, and that they would still to this day offer it up to them. All right. So there is a cover up going on at the highest levels of the U.S. Senate in terms of these issues, which is suggested by the presence of a Victoria Tenzing, the former chief counsel for the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. And what we've talked about very recently about Scott Stedman's reporting on the closeness of the co-chair, the Democratic Party co-chair of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, Mark Warner, to the highest levels of Psi Group, NSO Group in terms of Israeli military intelligence corporate cutout, but Israeli intelligence and very close connection to the highest Omri Levi, I think the guy's name is. All right, the former chief, Victoria Tenzing, the former chief counsel for the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, said that she had not heard of any such thing happening before. Quote, usually the agency tries to circle the wagons and protect the director from ever having to provide facts, unquote, she said. The fact that he was privy to the gross violations that occurred here, it is what is significant. Who? That he was, that Tenet was
it sounds
privy.
like
She's exposing
wait,
Tenet, right?
That's what I'm getting out of this, which is very interesting. If you also go back to this background with Tenzing and DeGeneva and this whole clique of people, it's interesting that she would be pointing out, oh, by the way, this is unprecedented. But the fact that this that this man was privy to the gross violations that occurred here, obviously, it seems to me she's referencing the gross violations taking place by the CIA is very significant. It's almost like on one hand, like this is unprecedented, but it's not without its merits, folks.
Right.
That's what it sounds to me like.
Yes. After 12 years, Sorowski withdrew his lawsuit. So this must have been going on the whole time that the question of the AIPAC spying scandal was going on, which included on through the Obama administration partially, where it was eventually dropped, it looks like. There's a couple people were indicted, but it didn't really go much of anywhere. And similarly to earlier generations, such as the Pollard spy scandal that went into the highest levels of moles at the highest levels of the U.S. national security establishment, that none of those threads were ever pulled. This sounds like the opposite, almost like beyond that, where the CIA was disciplined intensely by bringing in the ADL to help train them sensitivities to the right of a foreign government to run influence operations and spying operations at the highest levels of the most powerful country in the world, allegedly. Okay, after 12 years, Sorowski withdrew his lawsuit. He said that he was not concerned about financial compensation, but wanted merely to bring facts into the public eye and to use them to spur changes in the CIA. He said that he was still, quote, proud of his service with the CIA and, quote, had a deep and abiding respect for the organization and its missions. All right.
By the way, I went through and, real quick, I clicked on the article that referenced the Victoria Tenzing quote, and it was from a Daily Beast article from April 23rd, 2012 by Eli Lake, another interesting character, titled, Ex-Chief, CIA investigation could be construed as anti-Semitic. And in it, looking at Victoria Tenzing's quote, it looks like she's actually commending George Tenet for being forthright about the nature of the quote anti-Semitic nature of activities going on within his CIA, and that he worked to clean it up. What I get the sense is there was a lot of arm twisting going on behind the scenes that led to this cleaning up of this quote anti-Semitic element within the CIA. That's my impression based on all that.
We remember what we reported on from the book Seeds of Fire in regards to Tenet by who's that? Martin Dillon or
was it Gordon? It was Gordon Thomas.
Gordon Thomas. You're right.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. Gordon Thomas, right, who was the co-author of Robert Maxwell, Israel Super Spy, reports early on in the book that Tenet came in to his position, ongoing position as the DCI, Director of Central Intelligence for the then incoming Bush administration, and that the things that were on his plate included the question of the relationship of Israeli intelligence in a European theater to what the Red Mafia, to Russian organized crime, in terms of things like nuclear materials, black market nuclear materials, things around dirty bombs, and that's what he was going in to brief the new president George W. Bush in his early days in terms of the president's daily briefing, intelligence wise. So so obviously behind, we never heard of this publicly. I've never heard of any of that information other than inside that book. So obviously Tenet was dealing with all kinds of stuff in the run up to September 11th that would involve things like the intersection of Israeli intelligence with all kinds of other issues that are then highlighted by the fact that then he gets brought up in all of this later on. All right, so then he becomes we'll just hurry through here, but this is what's so wild about this, that people aren't looking at the background of this guy who wrote this little puff piece to end the Pentagon cells story in terms of a Trump administration. But here he goes to 60 Minutes in 1999, right? Departure from CIA in December 1999, hired by CBS News magazine 60 Minutes. His first story, Death by Denial, which was dealt with the scourge of HIV/AIDS in Africa. Lots of national security stuff and deception stuff around that issue. During that time, he also helped track down and interview the only participant in the 1993 World Trade Center bombing to remain at large. Is that really true? Is that the only participant? Remember the background of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, reported on by someone like the late journalist Robert Friedman, who wrote Red Mafia, talked about how one of the alleged participants in the World Trade Center bombing had been linked up with a Mossad-based Mossad-based safe house. So I imagine there's a whole nother network, state-based networks of participants in the 1993 World Trade Center bombing that Sorosky never quite interviewed. Okay. Oh, and then he moves on to NBC News 2004, where his work covering the 2006 Lebanon War earned him his first Emmy. All right, so he's covering sort of, this is obviously involves Israeli PR at the very least. U.S. Army stuff. All right, then he became a contributing writer at Vanity Fair in 2009, right, for the Obama administration. Later joining the masthead as contributing editor in 2018. He has written numerous high-profile, long-form investigatory pieces for Vanity Fair, like we pointed out before, including Tycoon, Contractor, Soldier, Spy, an in-depth profile of Blackwater founder Eric Prince. Will It Fly, a detailed expose of the mismanaged development of the Joint Strike Fighter, also known as the F-35 Lightning, which is interesting because in the story with he actually quotes Miller as, making further this point about the mismanagement of the Joint Strike Fighter. So it's interesting. I didn't realize he had this background actually reporting on it. And then, did Israel avert a Hamas massacre? On how Israeli intelligence officials, quote, may have narrowly averted their nation's own 9/11, unquote, October 2014. I wonder if he covered the background of Hamas as having been originally funded and set up by half of Israeli intelligence. He probably didn't cover that background. He probably didn't.
Probably not.
Documenting evil inside Assad's Hospital of Horrors from June 2015. Man of Her Dreams, surgeon, frenemy of the state, about billionaire Peter Thiel's national security work for the Trump administration. It's cute. He's got some cute titles. Harvey Geddon, inside Harvey Weinstein's frantic final days. And The Y Squad, chronicling the secret history of the world's most elite and elusive counterterror force. What is the Y? Oh, of course, it's Yamam. It's top Israeli. They're the top. They're the most elite.
Interesting.
So all right. So there you go. That who and as you go further down, it shows that because, like it said earlier on, he's TV. He's a producer. He's way inside Hollywood. So all his big stories basically get turned into television or movies.
And then he worked on this NBC docuseries called The Wanted, the first episode, which focuses on an Iraqi refugee, one of the early leaders of the Islamist Ansar al-Islam organization. And then down here, the last two things. Soralski's Vanity Fair piece, Harvey Geddon, was optioned in March 2018 by Ryan Murphy and Fox 21 Television Studios. And then in 2019, it was announced that Soralski's Vanity Fair piece, Tycoon, Contractor, Soldier, Spy, will serve as the basis for the script of the forthcoming film, Prince of War, about the controversial life of Eric Prince, an ex-Navy SEAL and founder of the private military contracting firm Blackwater. So his respective work on Harvey Weinstein and Eric Prince, I guess in the case of Harvey Weinstein, it's being optioned as a potential movie or television script. With Eric Prince, it's already a confirmed movie script that's in process. So
I wonder if he interviewed former Blackwater executive or C-level officer Greg Smith about for the story on Eric Prince. Probably
wouldn't
not.
that be something?
Yeah. So this is sort of wild. So Prince of War. There was the film about what's his name, the Russian arms dealer that had a similar title.
Victor Boot.
Yes, the Lord of War. That was called the Lord of War, and now we have the Prince of War. And then finally, we were just looking at this. This is the whole nother aspect. We didn't realize the deeper background of all of the escalation of the story on the Somali pirates, and that he was part of the reporting on that, the documentary, and documenting the role of the Puntland Maritime Police Force. Basically, looks like it was created out of a suggestion by Eric Prince, and then with some kind of UN proclamation involved, and the quote. This is his documentary, and this is final. PMPF, he profiles the PMPF as it takes, quote, the hijacking of the African waterways and the kidnapping of innocent citizens into their undertrained hands, unquote, and, quote, face mutiny, death, and a loss of corporate funding in their dangerous quest to free the Middle East shipping industry from terror, unquote. Film's world premiere took place at the Tribeca Film Festival in 2013. Wow. Okay. All right.
And it's very interesting. The Puntland, and I won't get into it right now, but the Puntland Maritime Police Force has its roots. Eric Prince says that he came up with the suggestion for this entity, and also it's been funded from the very beginning and continues to be as of 2015 by the United Arab Emirates, which of course is right at the epicenter of so much of the global intrigue surrounding the remaking of the Middle East, as well as the ultimately became the installation of Donald Trump as president. So
there you go. All right, so there's a whole nother story, I would imagine, behind what is shown in this Vanity Fair embedding with Pentagon leadership in Trump's chaotic last week. It's interesting, these titles, right? They're sort of like Harvey Geddon, the frantic last days, I mean. All right, but meanwhile, who is Trump pardoning? Okay, we
great
can't
question.
see
We
this.
heard a lot about we heard a lot about Steve Bannon, and we heard a little bit about Elliot Broidy. But there's a couple of people who we heard less about. Let's get into those people.
All right. Trump pardons Hillel Namad, Madison Avenue art dealer. The New York
like
dealer.
You hit the paywall.
Yeah. But we can see the front of it. There we go. We'll move quickly because we can't. There's a lot. We're going to have to do a whole show basically on the background here. The New York dealer, scion of a powerful art world family, pleaded guilty to running an illegal gambling ring in 2013. And the reason why this is important, and this has not been focused on almost at all, is this was being run out of Trump Tower, actually. And it looks like it interfaced with the epicenter of the Red Mafia types that were actually listed on the bottom of the VT article that we covered in one of our shows from 9/11 to 11/9, talking about mapping 9/11 for Fort Lee, about Fort Lee, New Jersey, and about the massive amounts of Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, then National Security America members had been set up in these towers there, these condo towers in Fort Lee, the mob background of Fort Lee way back, but then how it become an epicenter of Ukrainian and Cypriot, Red Mafia sphere, Israeli mob types, and that some of these people had under Preet Bharara at Southern District, New York, Attorney General's office or U.S. Attorney's office had been indicted and I believe convicted, a whole bunch of them. And there seems to be the suggestion in this VT article that that these networks played helping roles in relationship to at least the New York component of September 11th. All right, so I'd say this pardon here really gets to the heart of from a 9/11 to 11/9.
And once again, it further discloses that from an extended network, from the extended overall Trump network, from his from all the way from the domestic assets within things say such as Council for National Policy and many offshoot groups, as well as Trump's business connections within, say, New York, New Jersey Port Authority, the regulation of crime syndicate that's such the center of this intrigue surrounding issues related to Russia, Israel, etc. Trump is not just somebody. He's more. We have not had another politician or American president in our modern. Certainly, I can't think of another politician that has these many connections to direct and indirect players in the September 11th operation and all the events surrounding it as Donald Trump, and even an extended indirect connection such as pardoning a figure such as this. I mean, just another indicator that's another reason why we believe that last administration we had was a unique danger in terms of an actual threat to our system in ways we hadn't seen before, and why we're so insistent that the truth needs to come out about what has taken place over these last several years.
Yes. All right, and there'll be some just one other later story actually or two other later stories that we'll talk about some of that truth that needs to continue to come out, and like you said, push for an accountability around it. And the accountability has to be not just with Donald Trump, the individual here, but really the entirety of the system that somehow allowed this to happen. That includes the media, but also high levels of the government that were obviously engaged in some kind of cover-up, like we pointed out earlier, in terms of the basics of Cambridge Analytica not being even pursued via the Senate Select Intelligence Committee, let alone the deep connection to Israel and that whole scenario. Okay, so here's another, a lot of focus was given to that basically the Trump administration allowed Pollard's parole to run out is I think what happened. There was no pardon given to Pollard, but they didn't re-up his parole, so he was allowed to then leave the country, then goes on the now deceased most major backer of Trump and the Republican Party from the Zionist position, Sheldon Adelson's private plane, then directly meets Benjamin Netanyahu there and proceeds to kiss the ground as he says he comes home finally. But here Trump goes beyond that and uses his pardon power to pardon a foreign intelligence officer of some sort who was involved in handling Jonathan Pollard. Of course, even this is partially a cover-up. Trump pardons Avi M. Sella, Jonathan Pollard's handler. This puts an end to the open wound of the episode after 35 years, Pollard said. No, it does not, John. It does not put an end to it, because you know who else has been credibly fingered as a handler of Jonathan Pollard and Donald Trump is Benjamin Netanyahu, while he was in New York City as the Israeli representative to the UN in the middle of the 80s. And in the next stories, we'll see that was a key time for both the Soviets and the Israelis, I would say, in relationship to the eventual American POTUS Donald Trump.
And it's very interesting. Sella, if you go back to even the work of once again the LaRouche organization before it lost its way, it seems like the Executive Intelligence Review stories going back to the 80s and 90s. That Avi M. Sella is identified as a primary handler of Jonathan Pollard, along with somebody else we've talked about before on our program, Joseph Bodansky, in that Bodansky introduced Avi M. Sella to Jonathan Pollard, and from there you go. So that raised some very interesting questions from an extended level of what you pointed out of Bodansky's writings as it related to the Ghouta Syrian the events in Ghouta, Syria, with the chemical attacks in the summer of 2013. So there's a lot more full circle type of analysis. I think we will try to get into here down the road here in the not too distant future regarding this aspect of the Pollard operation, and even bringing in a bigger Israeli/Soviet type of angles to this bigger operation at play.
Definitely, Greg. That's an important point. The Bodansky connection is crucial because what's actually going on here is Avi Sella is actually an Air Force. I believe he's an Israeli Air Force colonel. Bodansky comes to the United States in 1979, I believe, straight out of being the journalist for the Israeli Air Force, I think, and basically is identified as a potential member of LACOM,
Yes.
which makes total sense. LACOM is Israeli Scientific Intelligence, the Bureau of Scientific Research, the background of the nuclear espionage, biological espionage, and really what Robert Maxwell's role as a publisher, a worldwide publisher, in gathering scientific materials and publications from all around the world, was obviously some kind of agent of LACOM.
And we'll link in the notes when we post this the Israeli spy network that Jonathan Pollard left behind from EIR Volume 25, Number 44, November 6, 1998, by Joseph Bruda. It really gets down deep into a lot more of the details surrounding Joseph Bodansky as well as other figures in this bigger affair as it related to the events leading up to the Pollard scandal, as well as since, even with some of the Iraq propaganda that was going on in the late 90s during the Clinton administration with the network, a lot of it surrounding the clean break and all that. So
exactly. And I was looking for a book. There's another book. Maybe we'll return to it when we cover more Avi Sella. Is actually Ari Ben Menashe's book, Prophets of War, deals with some more background of Sella. And then I think it's also in Dangerous Liaison by the Coburns. All right, so there's a lot on this background, and part of the point in terms of this connection here with Sella and the Israeli Air Force and Bodansky is then they're brought into JINSA. JINSA is created at that time, and Bodansky becomes the technical writer for JINSA, which is where what's identified as a Soviet-Israeli cell
brought in by Richard Pearl and Stephen Bryan.
And then Ladine is in the works there. And so you see this whole neocon cell that can maybe even be more obviously seen as a some kind of Soviet Israeli cell, it looks like. But we'll dip back in there because there's still a lot more unexplored in terms of the long-term Russian intelligence cultivation of Donald Trump, which is part of what we've been exploring over the Trump years. So here's the back to Vanity Fair, which is interesting here. They are releasing a piece by Craig Unger, who's following up his crucial work, House of Trump, House of Putin. It was a crucial work in terms of the background. Unger basically dug deep into who bought the apartments in Trump Towers. He poured over thousands of records to look for those who were associated with the Russian mob, and found a lot, and then goes from there. And a really interesting book. And so his new book is called American Compromat, and quote from Vanity Fair, quote, "He's a lot of fun to be with," unquote. Inside Jeffrey Epstein and Donald Trump's epic bromance. Beginning in the late 80s, the infamous sex trafficker and the future president and their mutual friend Ghislaine Maxwell palled around for almost 2 decades. In an excerpt from his new book, American Compromat, the author exposes their shared taste for private planes, shady money, and foreign-born models, many of them, quote, on the younger side, unquote. That's obviously quoting Donald Trump when he was talking about Jeffrey Epstein on the public record in the early 2000s, that, hey, they have a similar taste for women, many of them on the younger side. So I think there's an interesting thing to be learned potentially in figuring out Vanity Fair as the publisher of this and how this is all going to be spun too. And it's very possible that part of what will be done even through Unger's book is a potential a firewalling of Israel from the situation, because it's become so obvious that the Epstein is Israeli military intelligence. Although it will fill in the Russian piece probably to a level that has not been filled in so far.
On that note, though, I do believe we found something. I believe, was it a tweet? Was it from Craig Unger, or was it quoting Craig Unger that the Epstein Ehud Barak dynamic would be featured in this book? So I mean, it could go places. We'll have to see. We'll have to see. But
you're right,
I'd be
Greg.
very interested. And I'll say this real quick. I'd be very interested in regard to that, because on one hand, like, we've identified obviously like the this like split, quote unquote, between Netanyahu and Barak factions in Israel over what Ryan Dawson, as you've identified to me, refers to as almost like Netanyahu. Trump sided with like the lesser evil of Netanyahu because Netanyahu's not compromised by the Epstein or whatever. That's another way for him to basically like cover for Trump and justify like continuing to like try to portray Trump as some kind of lesser evil, because Trump himself's not complicit in the Epstein crimes, which is of course a load of BS, I think. But the idea that it's split, but on one hand, like, we understand like Netanyahu's very hostile nature towards like all things, I believe, American and US, but also then making sense of combining that and bridging that with the nature of like an Ehud Barak, maybe more of like a aspects of his portion of the Israeli establishment in terms of working with the Clintons, and then also even bringing in aspects probably more or less related to things such as like I believe Weinstein and Ehud Barak's relationship was known to be pretty close. So there could be some answers question that maybe bridge the gaps on those varying things that we're trying to connect the dots on and figure out. And then one more thing on this topic right here, what becomes obvious out of this, regardless of what the intentions of Vanity Fair or Craig Unger or what their modus operandi is in putting this information out. I don't know what it is. I'm not going to try to, make heroes out of them or anything, but it's interesting that now, with the benefit of hindsight, with Trump out of the White House, it's just so obvious just how much was just how much of a firewall and just how much information was not even seeing the light of day with all of the coverage of Trump and the media being seen as like so anti-Trump, and they just hate him and want to destroy him in every way possible. So many things never saw the light of day, and it's amazing just now. Now you can start to look at it with hindsight a little bit.
Oh yeah, they're so right, because even like this tells a little bit more of the background of the Jill Harth story. I believe she was like the first big accuser of Donald Trump's sexual assaults, and there was an Epstein connection in the background to the Harth accusations directly, and none of that was ever really talked about in the media. And so you're right, Greg. So now Donald Trump's out, and now they're going to start talking about how obvious this deep this Trump Epstein relationship was.
Yeah, and also E. Jean Carroll, who I think is credibly accused Donald Trump of rape, to the point to where Trump's believed the DOJ took action to try to throw her claims out. Is that correct?
Yes.
E. Jean Carroll case,
but they weren't able to.
She wrote an in-depth story about. She also just wrote an in-depth story about Jill Harth, also for Vanity Fair. So very interesting going on with Vanity Fair here. There's a lot of good information around some type of obvious angle with their reporting.
So there's a lot that it will be very interesting. I think you're right, Greg, to see what's actually in the Unger book. The big reveal at the end of this piece in Vanity Fair includes this is interesting. This Malova figure, who's was a former Miss Universe, part of the Trump pageant universe, She then appeared in gossip columns as the love interest of men ranging from comedian Gary Shandling to hedge fund billionaire George Soros. You remember? I remember that whole thing of George Soros and Trump in Chicago, the funding of that whole
Yeah.
situation that never really got dealt with. But the big payoff at the end of this article is that it reconfirms the actual what was floated as a key data point to deceive the MAGA and Q people specifically in terms of Trump supposedly being the one out of the goodness of his heart and proof that positive that he was going to rout out all of the pedophiles, that he was the one who ratted on Epstein to the cops. And it turns out, as we had, been talking about, that it really came down to the former Wexner, Les Wexner, then Abe Gossman estate in Florida, that Trump basically came in, elbowed Epstein out of the way when Epstein had brought him in to just look at it, apparently. And then Trump comes in there, buys it up, then flips it directly to Russian sphere oligarch Dmitry Rybolovlev for double the money. And then
Indeed,
Trump, in the
indeed.
wake of that, basically then is upset with Epstein's being angry with him or something like that,
And
then
he's
sort of
able
pushes him
to
under the bus.
Yeah. And also, Trump would be willing to maybe work with authorities against somebody who he now saw as an enemy, but doesn't mean he did it out of the goodness of his heart or for any reasons of actually trying to actually expose anything serious that was going on. No, it was because he was just this was a former good friend who he had a falling out with. Of course, he would cooperate with the authorities, but in a way, he'd make sure in a way that wouldn't implicate himself or anybody really seriously, ultimately, when it comes down to it. So, while at the same time, he's still putting in at DOJ his, the man who gave at no, not DOJ, I'm sorry, Department of Labor, his sweetheart deal attorney Acosta, and still having Alan Dershowitz represent him and all that. So it's ultimately it's a big pile of BS at the end of the day. The idea that Trump did this out of the goodness of his heart and then started cooperating with the authorities because he was so disgusted by what happened. I mean, it's just so fake, and it's very obvious.
So this will be very interesting to see what else is in this book. So the next story then is some just came out this morning, really, how the KGB hooked Trump from Spy Talk. American Kompromat, a new book by Craig Unger, gets the lowdown from former Russian and U.S. spies by Jeff Stein. Was Donald Trump a Russian asset? Just how compromised was he? And how could such an audacious feat have been accomplished? Based on extensive exclusive interviews with dozens of high-level sources, Soviets who resigned from the KGB and moved to the United States, former officers and agents in the CIA and FBI, lawyers at white shoe Washington firms, and an analysis of thousands of pages of FBI investigations, police investigations, and news articles in English, Russian, and Ukrainian. Veteran investigative reporter Craig Unger's American Kompromat unearths the unsettling facts behind the theories of Trump's compromise by the Kremlin. It's a story that should rattle anyone who cares about the future of democracy in America. And we haven't fully read through this article yet thoroughly, but it did cross my eyes that there was a confirmation of an important detail that we had noticed and picked up in the AnteDote, probably from Unger's book, I think originally. Maybe not, maybe somewhere else, but I think it was from Unger's book, House of Trump, House of Putin, about the relationship of Donald Trump when he was outfitting one of his hotels with this known Soviet-based intelligence electronics store owned by Semyon Kislin. And that from this article, Unger seems to basically put that as the origin point of the KGB's cultivation of Donald Trump. So a lot of these stories, like if anybody's been listening to the AnteDote for the last years, we've been pointing directly at all of this, and so it is very, very interesting to see the investigative journalism confirm a lot of this to a substantial degree.
And go look at the relationship of Sam Kislin with Rudy Giuliani. He's right at the center of this Ukrainian operation, which we're more and more looking at as an extension of elements of the same global network involved in many aspects of the September 11th. Once again, going 9/11 to 11/9 to 1/6, and you see a continuity in so many ways. And there's the book Jeremy's holding up right now, Red Mafia. by
And
Robert Friedman.
and actually, I think Greg, we might have actually originally learned this thing, the Kislin. No, it doesn't. It doesn't cover the relationship with Trump in this book, but the relationship with Giuliani and Kislin is covered in Red Mafia, and so that it's an interesting piece. We'll return to that too. So we'll collect some of these pieces, these fragments that we've been following for the last years, and bring in some of this newer journalism and work to finish the thread in some ways, and push it for an accounting, not just a justice accounting, but a social, intellectual, macro political accounting for how did we get through 4 years with virtually no serious public talk about these things, with the guy as the most quote unquote most powerful man in the world in this whole background here. And so I think that's going to become very, very important. All right.
Indeed.
And then
we'll be going back to this definitely.
all right, finally, our final story for today is an interesting one because there's a lot going on here that we have to unpack eventually. So I just will mention it for now. This is a story by let's see, by Dave Gershgorn, I think is who the writer is. And so this is from Will Oremus's Twitter account. Quote, in more than 60% of cases documented by researchers, GPT-3 created sentences associating Muslims with shooting, bombs, murder, and violence, unquote. GPT-3 is the quote unquote open AI. It's the third version of where you can plug in prompts to it and then it will write things that look like they're human. Okay. And so people have been doing experiments with this over the last year, really, with all poetry, conversations, and it's pretty effective. And so now it's being unpacked that, as people were warning, and this is probably because of the pollution of the entirety of the public language sphere by things like the war on terror and all of the deceptions of all of that. And so this is why the hardcore Israeli background of the war on terror, especially someone like Benjamin Netanyahu, is so crucial to understanding why now, in more than 60% of the cases documented by researchers, this open AI, artificial intelligence writing, a deep learning program created sentences associating Muslims with shooting, bombs, murder, and violence, unquote, right? We're talking about more than a billion, how many billion people on the planet, and okay, you point to Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and stuff like that. But can you imagine if this was like if it was like Jews or Christians, you plug them in, and 60% of the sentences by the objective open AI software program came up as terror, murder, bombs, shooting, murder, and violence, what the outrage by the ADL would be.
Of course.
The anti-Muslim bias of an algorithm like GPT-3 is a reflection of the data set, sure. But Dave Gershgorn gets at a crucial point here. What about the bias of the tech decision makers who acknowledge GPT-3's bias and decide it's worth productizing anyways? But, and this quotes from his article, but still, OpenAI released the model in a closed beta and even sold access to the algorithm. Microsoft Israel, Microsoft Pentagon Cloud, Jedi Pentagon Cloud, Adalom, Talpiot, Israeli Tech Transfer, exclusively licensed GPT-3 with the intention of putting it in products, though we don't know which ones yet. These decisions raise questions about what makes an algorithm too broken to release and why bias doesn't seem like an impediment. And by the way, they mentioned this scandalous story of this AI, a Black American Google and AI researcher who was let go in some kind of scandalous, deceptive way, it looks like. It's almost like Timnit Gebru is her name, et al. Had a point about the inherent problems with large language models. And it was actually looks like it was one of her papers that dealt with these kinds of issues inside of the alleged objective approach to open AI systems that got her into the ultimate trouble with the high levels of Google administration. All right. Any last comments, Greg?
It's as you can see, this is definitely a rough test drive of what you can of our morning show here, and it's good. I'm glad we're doing this because it's an opportunity to work out some kinks in terms of our way we're going about doing this program. But I would like for this in the future to be a platform. It's not going to be quite like any. I don't think it'll be quite like the other morning shows. Very much, obviously, I think inspired by like almost like being like an antidote, so to speak, to a Democracy Now. That's what we talked about, like the Amy Goodman show, Democracy Now, and kind of being an antidote to that. But I would like for this. I like this concept in that we can cover stories, and we'll be more mindful of time and things like that in the future as we get our footing and our groove going a little more. But covering some of the stories that are relevant to the moment that we may not get time to get into on our program, or just things that we want to have more time to discuss that we wouldn't either would devote time to on our program, or have more of a exclusive platform to discuss things. So definitely something we're looking to do, maybe start out hopefully once or twice a week, but definitely something we want to get off and running here to increase our foothold and increase the amount of work and information we're putting out there. So I think this is a very, very good way for us to do that, and I hope that people catch on to this, and that they're able to get something out of it. And so definitely just looking for stories that are going to be relevant to a daily or weekly moment at the moment, and covering those in a manner that we wouldn't otherwise be able to just in the context of our regular recordings and live streams. So
thank you, Greg, for that. And yes, and so anybody out there who has any input, ideas, support for us in terms of this show, how's the length? We just went about an hour. That we were talking about, should we go half hour to an hour? All that kind of stuff. We're open to input. And thank you very much, everyone out there. And thank you, Greg, very much. I'm going to play our outro cartoon made by John Swin on the way out here. Okay. Bye, everybody.
We must speak the truth about terror. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories, malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
Huh? What happens? I tell you what happens. Blam!
I have a window that looks directly at the World Trade Center, and I saw...
No collusion!
Shit's getting way too complicated for me.